one of our very first. Oh, perfect. Um, but it means I think we don't have to stick to the traditional literary format for book talks, because I haven't done one and Simon hasn't done one. So if you are sitting there in the audience thinking, well, this isn't how the literary book talks are supposed to go, we're going to break all the rules today, which I think is great fun. Now, some of you might be aware of Simon's work. You might know it really well, or you might be coming here for the very first time. Today, we're going to be talking about Simon's latest book, which is called Where? So Simon, I'm going to start just by asking you, I think, maybe just to introduce yourself. Now, if we were to go online, which I have, there are various descriptions of you on the internet. Some websites would call you an artist, some would call you a zine maker, some would call you an evaluator or a researcher. But I think there's one in the book where you just describe yourself, probably as a young boy, as a person who loves cats. So can you introduce yourself to the audience in whatever way, whatever words you think make sense today?
Certainly. So hello, everybody. Thank you for coming. I can see some friendly faces from other hemispheres, in fact, on the screen. So that's really fantastic. Yeah, I guess I describe myself as somebody these days, or I try and describe myself as somebody who writes and draws about stuff that's happened, and increasingly, and that's always been about stuff that's happened to me, and increasingly that's kind of also turned into stuff that happened to other people, particularly kind of historically, and that's a kind of a way of avoiding some of those bigger thorny words like artist or writer or author or cartoonist or whatever it might be. But essentially I've been making comics and zines for a very long time. A zine, for those who don't know, is sort of a homemade self-published pamphlet that can contain pretty much anything. It's sort of part of a big movement of self-publishing. It's been around for quite a long time. And that's kind of where I kind of make and share a lot of my art. I have produced a zine called Minor Leagues, which is like a regular personal magazine type thing of comics and drawings and stories for the last, I think, about 5 years or so now. I think that series has been going, but I'm doing this for about sort of 12 or 13 years. But none of that pays the day job, pays the bills. So the thing that pays the bills is a day job as a senior research fellow at the University of West of England, which if you're Bristol based, you'll know. Hopefully, anyway. And I do a lot of work in the kind of creative and cultural sector around how we support innovation and creative work of all kinds in the region, and all of the challenges that kind of come with that. And that's where some of the evaluation work comes in. I do a lot of evaluation for cultural activities and creative activities. But I trained as a geographer, which means I did geography degrees left, right, and centre, undergrad, masters, and PhD. And geographers are very kind of interested in place, memory, space, and that kind of stuff, which is sort of what I've returned to and where is those kinds of interests. And as the book does say, I do also love cats. So in fact, a cat just walked in and out. So at some point in the Zoom, you'll probably get a view of the cat.
Perfect. I feel like it's a Zoom mandatory thing right now. So the book Where that we're talking about today, as you said, it existed in some previous fantastic, and we'll have some links in the chat if you haven't yet got a copy. So it existed in some previous formats. That's right. Was it kind of serialized? Was it through some of your zines?
Yeah. Yeah, that's correct. So part of the way that I've always made work, I guess, is there's this kind of cliche of the unfinished novel in the top drawer. And so what I discovered was that actually the good thing about zines and self-publishing is you can make work and put it out there by just printing out, folding, stapling, sending it to friends, that kind of stuff. Selling it at fairs. It's a good way of getting work done, and then you can start to move on and learn from and improve and do that kind of stuff. So that, when it came to kind of starting writing this book, it felt like the natural home for me to kind of start releasing it through, like myself, through my zine. I'd already got a bunch of readers. People kind of knew me and my work, and I knew that they would probably come with me, even though it was a different direction and stuff. So yeah, it was serialized over four issues of my regular zine Minor Leagues, and that was between about 2018, and then I finished it at the end of 2019. So I took a couple of years on it.
Okay, fantastic. Well, before we get into some of the themes around the book and some of the things that happen, I thought it might be nice to ask Simon to start with a reading, just so that we can all get, I guess, a bit of the voice and the story of the book as well.
Sure. So I thought I might read a little bit from the preface, because that kind of sets up, I guess, the context for the book and talks a little bit about the place as well, that I'm writing about and that the book kind of deals with, in that kind of context. As well as being my first kind of proper like book talk thing, this is also my first time ever reading in public. Either apologies in advance, or let's see if I find out from a natural. So when my dad turned 60, I promised him a painting. One reason I made this promise was because the summer after finishing university, I had moved home and agreed to keep my unemployed self useful by painting my parents a painting for their newly decorated sitting room. I was not, and am not, a gifted painter, and the painting in question is categorically not a good painting. Nonetheless, it has been hanged on one wall or another, wherever my parents have lived for the past 15 years. I find it somewhat mortifying, but Dad had said he'd only take it down if I made him something with which to replace it. So the first reason for offering a new painting was a selfish one. The second reason was because the painting I wanted to replace, and the painting I wanted to replace it with, was supposed to depict somewhere that was very important to our family. And I thought Dad, having at the point of his 60th birthday recently retired, might like to have a more thoughtful memento of that place than the odd, dull, grey, beige thing that I'd previously given him. So the second reason was probably a little bit less selfish. The painting was going to be of Titterston Clee Hill in Shropshire, where Dad had worked as an engineer on a radar station. Shropshire, most maps will tell you, sits in the West Midlands on the border between England and Wales. Cheshire lies to the north, Staffordshire to the east, and Herefordshire and Worcestershire to the south. Wales is due west. We lived in the borderlands, halfway between the larger towns of Shrewsbury to the north and Leinster to the south, in a little village called Canaan. It was all very picturesque, and a time our family remembers fondly. In 2017, Dad got ill and died. Cancer and premature death are a fucker for playing with the things you once imagined static or stable, so it's no surprise that during the period of his illness, thoughts about growing up, how our family came to be, and where we were from bubbled up as we sought in trauma and in grief to find common narratives to our diverging life courses, things that would keep us connected with each other and with him. With all this in mind, the idea of a painting started to feel insufficient, and wanting to know more about where I'd grown up and whether knowing more would make any difference to me, the painting became this book. So this book is mostly about that one specific place where my dad worked and that one specific place where my family lived. It's being written in lieu of that painting, like one big apology for ever having started this whole painting business in the first place. I hope this settles the debt, though I no longer know what that debt is or to whom it is owed.
Fantastic. I think that's a great introduction into the book, and as you say, it really does summarize a lot of the themes. So there's a number of stories within the book, both kind of in prose and in the artwork as well. Let's start with the places and then move on to some of the people. So you've kind of prefaced it there, Clee Hill, this kind of area in Shropshire. Can you tell us a bit more, whether people have read the book or not, just what was so striking about it, and how you're thinking about it now?
So, I mean, the geography of Shropshire is relatively undulating, let's say, but there are three big hills. There's the Wrekin, there's Brown Clee, and there's Titterston Clee Hill. And Titterston Clee and Brown Clee are next to each other, Titterston slightly lower, but they're very prominent. So they play a visual role in, if you grow up there as I did, that you just see them all the time. So those hills particularly were a big kind of part of the landscape, quite literally, and kind of metaphorically for me growing up. And I moved there when I was about 4 years old. So it's the first place I remember living, and I moved away when I was 11. So that kind of sense of being a child and having an actual childhood in the countryside. So we lived in a village called Canaan, which had a village hall and a church and a little village school, but no other amenities. And it was about 3 miles to the nearest town, which is a place called Ludlow, which many people may know because they had a food festival for many years, got big castles, very picturesque, which is where I went to school for most of my time there. And sort of living in the middle of nowhere, and we lived in Canaan in a house that was newly built, along with about a couple of other dozen other ones, on the grounds of an old manor house called Canaan Court, and that manor house was still there all boarded up, but kind of just sat behind our house growing up. So there were woods, and there was an Iron Age hill fort at the top of our road, and that kind of stuff. So we had a kind of pretty idyllic setting in some ways. And then my dad worked in the radar station, which was built kind of on the very top of Titterstonclea Hill in the embankments of an Iron Age hill fort up there as well. And so he would be on call, he would often go up there to fix things, and this is sort of pre-automation. So his job in the late 80s, early 90s, which is sort of when the period of the book is kind of about those kinds of those places and those kinds of contexts. So there's these big radar balls, radomes that sit on top of the hill, and you can see them from wherever you are, again, in Shropshire, and so on. So those are the major places. And there's a few other places around Shropshire that kind of get drawn into the book, like Hopton Castle, which is nearby, that you know, within the sightline of Titterstonclea, and some of the settlements on Titterstonclea. So there's Clee Hill Village, there's Bedlam, there's Random, there's a few places. There was a place called Random, by the way, up on the hill.
And it really did strike me that there was these kind of main cast of characters in terms of the places, and also some that just get a brief notice or a brief mention. And that's actually quite similar with some of the people that come through the story. So we sort of have this, you know, main story around you, your father, your mum, Ali, you know, and we kind of hear about these key characters, but just holding them for a second. We also have these other characters who kind of pop up in the book. You know, one mention, I think, Ali's dad, the hospital nurses, Tim's family, you know, some of your friends. I don't know if this was kind of a deliberate structure to kind of really focus in the story on a few places and a few people.
Yeah, I think in terms of the people, obviously, so the book is structured that there's the narrative of my dad's illness and his passing, which kind of weaves through the book. And then there's a big bit of the book which is about my revisiting Clee Hill and exploring during the time of writing the book. And then there's quite a lot of digressions into the history of the hill and the history of the area. And so in the sense of the stuff that I was writing about within my closer circle, I guess, I was trying to I'm aware that actually in terms of a voice, I'm probably the only character with a real voice in the book, but that was kind of deliberate because I didn't really want to try and put words into the mouths of my you know, my brother Tim or my mum or my wife. You know, I didn't want to kind of try and, I wanted to acknowledge their presence, and I wanted, you know, the fact to know that they were on this journey. We were all on this journey together, and it was very terrible and very hard, but also, you know, there's kinds of all sorts of strange things about going through grief and losing somebody in the way that I lost my dad and stuff. So it was sort of like I wanted to invoke them, I guess, and make sure that they were present and they were named and that they were understood. But I also didn't want to write too much about them in too much depth because I didn't want to try and tell their story on their behalf as well. So they are the, you know, the close people, you know, who kind of went through what we went through as well, actually. So, you know, my brother lives in San Francisco, and he obviously came back and forth during my dad's illness, and obviously my mum and Ali and I were kind of also present a lot. So there's that kind of sense that there was a kind of a team, if you like, involved in that story. And then there's a lot of other kind of characters who come and go, which are historical figures who I discovered through various archival working, looking through old newspapers and whatnot. So there was sort of a sense that I wanted to try and bring some other people's stories to life as well, to try and situate our own story in the landscape. I think we very often like to think that we're the only people who have lived somewhere and had particular kinds of experience. So by bringing through the historical stuff, I wanted to try and put names to both places and events that somehow echoed or were mirrors of or other sides of the same coin of what we were going through as well. So there's, you know, historical landed gentry people who passed away. There's nameless farmers who don't really get remembered, but who kind of are part of that landscape and that place as well.
Fantastic. Before we talk a bit about how all of that material and all of those stories came together in the book, would you be able to give us your second reading?
Sure. I was wondering which to do next. So I thought I might read a little bit about growing up in Shropshire. So growing up in Canaan in the landscape. And I should say that part of the book as well is the book oscillates between sort of long passages of sort of images, which are kind of comics, but they're kind of often one page sort of images and paintings and drawings that I've done, photographs and so on and so forth. So the idea is that the narrative kind of slips and slides. Sometimes it's text and sometimes it's not. So some of the story gets kind of carried by the words and some gets carried by the pictures. But I thought I might read a bit from a passage about living in Canaan and living as a kid in the countryside, because I thought, you know, nature writing, let's talk about some nature. That seems to be a good call. So I'm going to read, just get the little place markers. There we go. Here, life crawled like a dream. I'd lie in bed in the mornings, awake at sunrise, long grey curtains over sash windows. Sometimes I'd creep across my room to wave at the bin men, and they'd wave back. In the cold grey paper dawn, I'd listen to the wood pigeons. I knew very particularly that they were doctors of some sort. I didn't know their motives. I was convinced they were up to something sinister, hoo-hooing across the dump from the woods. A slate roof amplified the rain noise. The great storm of 1987 took a tile and threw a corner down to the front lawn, so it looked like a standing stone. One autumn, the leather jackets came out like a mini plague, undulating through the grass and across the paving slabs of the garden path, while in the summer, life on the patio was red mites, the colour of a word processor spelling error. In the back garden, the earth was wet. There was the smell of grass. In the spring morning, in the winter wind, in the March frost, or under the brown hummus sluice of autumn. We climbed the walnut tree that grew there, our own little river flowing from the sky. There were streams of white bark and small black knots tarred shut, like rocks in the rapids. The leaves were its banks, full in June, spare in December. We canoed up and down, learning the nooks and pools of each crook, and the best places to sit and dangle our feet. I never got stuck, and I never fell out. We'd play on the back lawn in the summer until the storm turned silent, jaundiced skies into black clouds, and the tension would yield, and we'd run around, picking up our toys in a bid to get inside, darting between the giant raindrops before there were no gaps of dry air left to occupy. In the garage, Dad taught us to make things out of wood and cooked whitebait on a camping stove. It was living here that I fell in love with the natural world. Everything was connected, wild, confusing, terrifying, comforting. I didn't think of what people did as being separate from what the birds and the beasts did. Homes popped out of the ground like shrubs. People planted fences in the same way that the marine ducks seeded themselves in piles of builders' waste. The earth birthed blue and white crockery pieces, while berries grew on barbed wire, and television eras throbbed with incoming cartoon energy. I came to know, without even realizing it, the smell of thousands of years of stratifying, rolling earth, and sheep wool and cow shit and clay soil and rotting leaves, and the bright voltage of water. I watched the purple plumish damson ripe in the hedge opposite our house, plump like wrens. They hung in the gap in the foliage that dropped to a wonky plank of wood pitched over a squelch of a ditch. I'd walk to the village school over that improvised bridge, up the small bank on the other side, over the fence and into the school field. I learned about the vegetable patch with its potatoes, clay pipes and slug traps full of homebrewed beer, about the mysteries of the garage with its tea chests and garden toys, Dad's white cupboard with boxes of capacitors and screws, about the green oil tank behind the little bit of fence and the plunge button you pressed to see how much oil was available, and about how the hornbeam Dad planted grew and why he'd have his photo taken next to it every year. I learned to swim, but wouldn't put my head under the water. I learned what a horse sounded like when it farted and how not to be scared of cows.
Fantastic. I'm so glad you chose that passage because I was going to quote bits of it to you. That page really, jumped out at me and the relevance to the theme, that we're talking about today. And the whole Festival of Nature program today on Sunday is all about nature writing from, lots and lots of different perspectives. Would you consider yourself a nature writer?
I'm not entirely sure. In some respects, I guess because I write about a lot of things that are kind of near and dear to me, and writing this book kind of reminded me the extent to which I have a very kind of long-standing relationship with what we would consider to be the natural world, the outside world, rural areas, the countryside, and so on. And I am still a big fan of animals. One of the bits of archival stuff in the book is it's one of these things I filled in as a kid saying, what are your favorite things? And as well as cats, I was talking about animals and all that kind of stuff. So in the sense that I am kind of preoccupied with that stuff, I think that I could be a nature writer, but I'm also kind of very mindful of the fact that, the thing that we call nature isn't really that necessarily separate from us. You know, we look at the natural landscape out in the fields and out in the kind of the countryside in this country in particular, and that isn't a natural landscape. That's a landscape that's been farmed for thousands of years. It's been modified, divided, subdivided. That's come and gone, and the sense that actually nature is also more broadly in our cities and in our homes and in the bits where it's not supposed to be, as much as we as humans are in the bits out there, the wilderness that we're not supposed to be in as well, in terms of that kind of dialectic between nature and stuff. So I'm quite keen to draw attention to the fact, and I think the book does this in a kind of passive way, but I'm increasingly interested in how to do it more directly, about the fact that there's a huge amount of politics to that kind of sense of what nature is and what nature isn't, you know, the natural world, the rural idyll, you know, and the book itself kind of tries to play with that sense of, I had in many ways a very idyllic childhood, but also in other ways, the area that I grew was beset by extreme rural poverty, really big, you know, differences in socioeconomic status. And that had a direct impact on me. And, you know, we certainly weren't in any way particularly well off, but we were by contrast, in a different kind of space. But, you know, I went to school with a lot of kids who had incredibly troubled kids, you know, had all sorts happen to them. So this sense that, you know, that the landscape and the place is probably really more, maybe I'm a landscape writer if I had to say something rather than a nature writer, because I'm really interested in how we give meaning to something that we see out the window and how that gives meaning to us. But obviously at the same time, I also really like spending time outdoors, and so therefore I end up writing about it. But it's kind of new to me. So this book is kind of a new direction for the work that I've made. And so I guess I'm probably still working that out. So maybe in a couple of years' time, I'll know the answer.
Okay, well, we'll have you back next year anyway. I have another big question I'm really interested in, which is about the physical nature that the book came together. But I did want to say to our audience, you know, do feel free now to start putting any questions you have in the chat function, and we will make sure that we pick them up in the time that we have available. So Simon, take us through the kind of, you know, building of this book, from that maybe that first few conversations with Little Toller to say, oh, I'm going to bring in all this artwork, and, you know, it's going to be a zine and a book and all of this. And also then, you know, you've done this over a couple of years. How is it, you know, how does it actually come together? And my third part of that question would be, breaking the rules again, you know, how important is it that it's a nice thing to have in your hands, isn't it? That it's a printed physical thing. Maybe so from conversation to physical thing in your hand, it'd be great to hear a bit about that.
So it kind of, so I started, you know, as I suggested in the bit that I read from the preface, like I'd been wanting to write something about Shropshire for quite a long time, and I hadn't quite worked out how to do that. And it was Dad's death that really kind of prompted that. And there were a couple of kind of serendipitous things that happened in sort of 2017. That's when Dad died in March 2017. And one was, I started watching a lot of episodes of Time Team, almost like as a kind of a group, a kind of a grief compulsion. So those who don't know, it was a series that ran from the early 90s through to about 2012. So where people did archaeological digs, they just had 3 days to do an archaeological dig, and it's fantastic. I love it very dearly. And it seemed to be a kind of a grief response, although, you know, it wasn't like my dad's favorite TV program or anything like that. But I discovered that my brother had been doing the same thing as well. It must have been a particular kind of comfort thing for us. So I got really into kind of history, and I was reconnecting with sort of the sense of, you know, archaeology and layering and stratifying and sort of time and people and place and things like that. And that started to kind of swirl around as maybe being one way to approach the work. And the other was a friend of mine from university moved, and I've been at university next to that 20 odd years ago, but she moved back to Bristol. And so I caught up with her again, which was really nice. And she was very interested in a lot of nature writing, things like this. And she was kind of interested in history as well, and landscape, and kind of sort of gave me loads of inspiration. So the book started to kind of come together from those two things, really. The kind of sense of like, here's a bunch of archival stuff we could look at, and then this kind of deep time thing. And it just kind of reignited something about landscape, which I've always been interested in and read about as part of my geography stuff. So geographers these days do a very broad church of things, but landscape studies and how we give meaning to them, how we live in them, how they are kind of represented and made as representations, and all those kinds of things are kind of part of what I'd learned about during education as well. And so I started to self-publish, started to write and research and start writing the first installment, maybe sort of the beginning of 2018 it must have been. And I didn't have a publisher at all at that point. I didn't have any clue how I would get it published or if I was going to get it published. So I kind of serialized it over the next couple of years. I did it in 4 parts, and they were all handmade books. So they were about 100 pages. I haven't got on hand, unfortunately. They were about 100 pages thick. I bought a really big stapler so I could staple them together, and I made little French flaps, so that's these little kind of things on all the zines, and I kind of made them. And once I got the first part done, I thought, well, what am I going to put in the second part? So then I wrote the second part, and then by the time I started work on the third part, I knew how it was going to end. And so around that time, I realized that I really wanted to try and get it published by somebody other than myself. I mean, I love self-publishing. It's a deliberate act on my part to, be in control and be close to the people that actually consume the work. It's not a kind of it's a destination itself for me. It's not just something that I do to get published, if you see what I mean. But this particular piece of work, I wanted to kind of try and get to a wider audience than I knew I could reach on my own. So I started making handmade versions so I took the 4 parts, and then I kind of edited them all around a bit and moved a few bits around and chucked some bits out, put a few bits in, and made some handmade books, which I made like a little book press out of an old piece of MDF and a couple of bolts and a bunch of PVA glue. And so I was making my own handmade books for a little while and sent them to various places, various friends. I know there's some people in the audience who have there's Warren waving. Warren is over in Virginia at the moment, so so because I had this kind of connection through the work I was making already, I was able to kind of sort of develop that, I guess, in dialogue with people. So I started corresponding with people about the versions of the book that I was making. And then I sent a homemade version of the book to an author called Max Porter, who some people might know, who wrote a book called Grief is the Thing with Feathers, and then he wrote a book called Lanny. They're both really great books. And he really liked it, and he put me in touch with Little Toller. And the Little Toller were like, let's do a book version. And I was like, fantastic. And so, so we agreed to do that earlier this year, and that's kind of how it came about. So again, I did a bit more editing and a bit more kind of revising to turn it into a book version. Graham, a Little Toller, who kind of helps with all their layouts and does all their design work, was very patient with me, saying, no, that word needs to go on the page before, because it's got to have a picture on that page and all this kind of stuff that comes with it, because it's very carefully designed so that the text will hand off to a series of images, and that the images need to be read almost like as a comic, as a story in themselves. Then it has to go back for text and stuff. But that sense of it having a materiality to it that you can hold and smells nice is all really important to me, because again, I come from a print background. I really like the simplicity of sort of just printing things for yourself. So I want to kind of maintain some of that sense in the design as well. So I design the covers, and we kind of design them to kind of look and feel a particular kind of way. And then Little Toller had it printed on a lithograph, which is kind of it's not a digital print method. The ink actually kind of sits on and soaks into the page, rather than it kind of be toner kind of stuff that you would get in other kinds of digital print. So it's actually real ink, and that's why it smells really nice. It's actual ink, and that I think really helps to give it kind of a sense of volume and weight, I think, to it, which is really nice. And because the images are so important to it, they're not kind of illustrations, although some are illustrations in the sense that they depict something that's happening in a piece of written text. So they're kind of a companion. Some of the story that only happens in the images. So to have kind of good quality, well-produced images that do that kind of stuff. And and the images themselves, they're all kind of collages, basically, of drawings and paintings I did myself, or they're old photos that have been processed to kind of be printable, and so on and so forth, and then kind of all just strung together.
We had a question in the chat. Actually, I'll just read it, because I don't know if it will come up in the recording or if everyone can see the chat. But it said, can you talk a bit about how you put the images together, the box of drawings, text, photos? I mean, you've touched on this, but I don't know if there's anything else you want to.
Yeah. So
there's such a key part of the book. It's hard to explain if you haven't seen it yet.
Yeah. So the drawings. I mean, the way that I've drawn in a different. In a number of different ways over the years. I started off quite meticulous in my drawing, and then actually Warren, who's asked the question, who's a fantastic artist in his own right, and makes just has a fantastic drawing practice where he's drawing all the time and just kind of in many different ways, where just the expressive scribble of the pencil is really, really important. And I kind of was really inspired by that when I first encountered his work, and that actually has had a big impact on how I produce the drawings for this. So what I would do is sometimes a snippet would come to my mind that I know will end up as prose, and this might actually answer Brian's question a little bit as well, that there's to some extent that there's the prose will kind of come out like in a little sequence or something, and then sometimes there'll be an event I want to try and depict but I can't find the words for it, so I would just draw quite quickly and just kind of do some scribbles and so on and so forth. So I would then kind of take those drawings. I wouldn't really work with them particularly. So some people might sketch and refine and refine and refine. I'd try to take a first take of a particular kind of drawing, which is why they look sort of quite scrabbly and scribbly. And then they get layered up with, I do sort of layers of paint and other pencil work, and then I scan them in and put them all together, and kind of that's sort of the technical side of how they get produced. But in terms of the ethos of them, it's very much around the first take, the first pass, and then energy. And there's a few different styles. So some are slightly more representational than others. So there's drawing of deer in there, for example, that looks like a deer. And then there's other bits of drawing which are actually taken from other places. So there's a childhood, so there's part of me, for example, having my dad reads Lord of the Rings to us as a kid, and I'm imagining being part of that story. And that line work is derived very much from looking at all the Bayeux tapestry and kind of medieval art and trying to kind of get some of that line work kind of sensation in there as well. And then there's some big tracts as well, which I just painted with big child's poster paint. And those ones are deliberately supposed to kind of almost look a bit like a kid's drawn them, because they're trying to evoke that kind of particular sense of, I guess, a childlike engagement with stuff as well. So the images are both, how they're drawn also matters in terms of what they're displaying, I guess. And then there's also kind of photo collages where it's a combination of paint and old photographs put together as well.
I really liked that the drawings weren't captioned in some ways. It just made for a very seamless experience, that you would read the images, or I could read them and maybe I thought something slightly different than you intended, but it worked quite well. So we've captured Brian's question, we think. I could read it. I'll just read it just in case anyone can't see or miss it on the recording. So the question is, the balance between art in text in your zines has flip-flopped somewhat from more art to less text, to more text and less art. Do you find this is driven more by the project or piece you're working on, or driven more by the interest in actually producing drawings, collage, and text at the same time?
Okay, so there's a bit more to answer from that. Yeah, I mean, I think it's kind of driven by the project. I think so when I was younger, the two things that I did was two of the things that I did, other than read the encyclopedia, which it was referenced in the book as well, because I was a nerd. I drew pictures endlessly, and I wrote stories. I loved writing, and I always did. And when I first came back to making stuff in my sort of, what would have been my sort of mid-20s, I started with drawing, so I made comics, and so that was kind of obviously very definitively a visual medium, obviously with bits of text in it and stuff. And Brian's been reading my stuff for a long time, so he's seen this kind of development, I guess, over time. But when I rediscovered writing, basically, because I do a lot of writing in my day job as an academic, but it's not the kind of writing that obviously this book is. And so I just really like writing. So that's kind of why that started, and that started to take kind of prominence. And I think since then, since doing Where and the stuff I've done since, I'm playing with that kind of balance. I'm trying to work out how those things can become even more interwoven. And at the moment, yeah, it's definitely kind of more text, fewer pictures. But I think it will probably change, although I don't know. I mean, I like the idea of having different. I've always liked the idea of having like a different set of tools depending on what you're doing. So another thing that I did recently was like a little zine about the English landscape, which is called Lie of the Land. And this is kind of, I'm going to hold it up, but it's kind of, these are all old photographs found from books that are collaged and layered, and then with found text as well, and also layered with my own paintings as well. So there's a little me walking through the landscape. But the idea being, again, that I've kind of got, there's the visual thing, and then there's also the textual thing. So there's a balance between all of those, I think. So I think I think I normally worked out what's happened after I've done it, if that makes sense.
And I'm really keen we get this last question in as well, because I think it's a great one. It's from Simon, so I guess that's hopefully a different Simon, or maybe you're asking yourself questions in the chat with Simon, which I think is a whole new development of this genre, which would be great. He said, I'm surprised that you didn't have the whole thing planned out from the beginning, since it reads in a very cohesive and structured way. Do you think it needed to go through the multiple stages you described to get to the finished article, or do you feel each stage was complete for the audience you were making it for?
I think both. I think that I tried to make each bit of it to be kind of internally coherent, so you could sort of so that it was kind of complete, as it were. So you'd still want to hopefully be the next one to find out, what happens next. But I think the first two issues, like I say, I put them together and they sort of had a bit of everything in it. It's almost like once I had all the material together, I was then able to see it in the whole, I think. And because I tried to make those things a bit more discreet in the beginning, there was an attempt to try and at least have some sense of cohesion to it. But actually, in terms of what's got moved, actually, the second, the third and fourth installments, the last two, are actually pretty much exactly the same as they appeared in the zine format. Slightly resequenced, so I think the stuff that was in the third one appears slightly earlier in the book now. And then the other first two bits kind of got rewritten into that. It's almost like I hit my stride with that third one. It's like, oh, this is what it's going, this is what it is. Because I think sometimes when you're writing and making stuff, you don't always know what's going to happen. You're not always sure what's going to come out of it at the other end. And I think that's part of why I guess people do make things in the way that they do, and certainly why I do. So I think it was a balance for the other Simon. The other Simon, it definitely wasn't me.
Fantastic. What's the response been like from the people who were in the book? Do they feel that you captured some of these very personal and private moments accurately? What did your mum think? That's the question.
I think she's in the audience. I'm not going to put her. I'm not going to put her on the spot and ask her to and ask her to say for herself. But yeah, it's obviously an incredibly emotive piece of work, and my mum particularly has been really great at understanding my need to kind of process what happened through the way that I process things, which is writing and drawing about them. And obviously, she trusted me to hopefully do a good job, and I think that she's been very moved by it, and I think that she's been able to read it, which is really fantastic, because obviously it's a real hard thing to do. So I think that there's been a great deal of support for it, which has been really nice from my kind of my family and friends, and which is really good. But obviously, the closer you are to the subject matter, the harder it is to probably engage with too much. So a certain sense of distance probably allows. But yeah, it's been and I think there's a lot of people, my friends who aren't necessarily in the book, but who can see, for whom it resonates with them, which has been really great to kind of hear as well. And certainly the serializing of thing helped that, people would get in touch and talking about how things were related, because I think the challenge with something like writing about grief is that it's both universal and unique. It's kind of like a snowflake. It's got the same kind of structure, looks superficially similar, but every time it's really, really different. So to find those resonances, I think, and other people to be able to kind of pick up on those, but see it from a different perspective has been really nice, because it is essentially about one hill in Shropshire, and one family and one house. So I hope that it's become more universalized than that, and I think that's working.
Brilliant. Last question, of course, is what's next? Have you signed a multi-book deal with Little Taller? Are you already working on the next zine? What can people expect next?
Well, that is a very good question, because to some extent, I've been making stuff for the last year or two since I finished making the zine versions of Where, so this has been processed in the background. So I'm still making my zine Minor Leagues, which is available from my online shop, and you can kind of go and see there. I'm working on a new issue of that. I made a couple of zines, that one about the landscape I just showed you, and I made one called What is Britain, which again uses archival materials and found text to kind of talk about, not so much about nature and landscape, but kind of about national identity and some of the big problematic kind of the things that underlay that, the British identity, and it does kind of relate to landscape and nature and place and the social justice and so on. And that one I made, and that's out, and that's also oops, that's it just there. And all of the proceeds to that will go to charities. So that's the Grenfell Tower Trust Foundation, sorry, Joint Council for the Welfare of Immigrants and the Sophia Lancaster Foundation. So all of that stuff. And I think in terms of the next big project, I've got some ideas. I haven't got a publisher lined up for it. I've got kind of, it's almost like I've got all the ideas, but haven't got the conceit. I don't know what it is that it's going to be about, but I know loads of things I want to do. And really, I want to kind of, I think, probably start to explore stories from kind of elsewhere in my family history, particularly my mum's side of the family up in Yorkshire. But also there's kind of other things that I want to float around there. I've always been interested in the unreliable narrator. You know, memory is famously unreliable, and part of this book is actually about how we make up stories about our past to understand our present, and sometimes we do that without thinking about what that means, what the ramifications of it are. So I'm quite interested in doing that. So I mean, W.G. Sebald is a fantastic author, was a fantastic author who I've been very inspired by in these kind of long historical autobiographical diatribe type books that you kind of read and then you go, is any of that true? Did any of that happen? So I'm quite keen on thinking about that. But for now, I'm just really excited the book is in the world. It's like my first sort of proper big book out there. So it's kind of overwhelming and exciting. But yeah.
Brilliant. Well, that's, I think, a perfect note to wrap up on. Overwhelming, exciting. So Simon's book, where we'll put the links in the chat again, or it's up at the top. Do get a copy. If you haven't read it, you must be intrigued by now. You must want to hold that book in your hand by now. Do join us for other bits of Festival of Nature. It's all online between now and the 12th. We're also going to drop our evaluation link in here, which would be amazing if you could fill that in. That's not an assessment of Simon and how well he's done and how well he read out loud. That's, just helps us to kind of get funding to keep all of this free, and also programming for next year. If you'd like to see more things like this, anything else we can add in. And otherwise, a huge thank you for Simon. It's been such an honor. I loved the book. It's been great to meet you. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me, and thank you everyone who has come to this. There's people from all over the place. So thank you.
Bye.